When we talk about baiting, one of the most important mindset shifts I want you to make right away is this. This behavior is not about communication, connection, or misunderstanding. It is about control. And once you really understand that, a lot of confusion starts to clear. Because so many people come into these relationships thinking, if I just explain better, if I just stay calm, if I just show them how hurt I am, surely they'll understand. But baiting isn't a failed attempt at understanding you. It's a deliberate attempt to manage you. Narcissistic baiting shows up most often when the narcissistic person feels a loss of power. Maybe you set a boundary. Maybe you stopped chasing. Maybe you stopped reacting the way you used to. Maybe you started to see the pattern. That moment when their sense of dominance wobbles is when baiting tends to escalate. And it's subtle. That's what makes it so destabilizing. If it were loud or obvious, you'd walk away. Instead, it's crafted to look accidental, casual, or even caring. The narcissistic individual is not sitting there thinking, how can we have a productive conversation? They are thinking, how do I get a reaction? How do I pull them back in? How do I reassert my relevance? And that reaction can be anger, tears, defensiveness, guilt, reassurance. Any emotional movement toward them will do. From their perspective, emotion equals engagement, and engagement equals control. This is why baiting often feels so confusing. You'll walk away from an interaction thinking, why did that derail me so much? Why do I feel dysregulated? Why am I replaying this in my head? And the answer isn't because you're weak or overly sensitive. It's because the bait was designed to bypass logic and go straight for your nervous system. These are not random remarks. They're emotional tripwires. Another thing that makes baiting so powerful is that it often happens under the guise of normal interaction. It might sound like a question, but it's really an accusation. It might sound like concern, but it's really a criticism. It might sound like curiosity, but it's really an interrogation. And if you respond emotionally, they've achieved their goal. If you don't, they may escalate, because the loss of control feels intolerable to them. And let's be clear here. Control doesn't always mean domination in the obvious sense. Sometimes it's about reassurance. Sometimes it's about making sure you still care. Sometimes it's about making sure you're still thinking about them. Being in your head is a form of control. Having the ability to disrupt your peace is a form of control, and narcissistic baiting is one of the most efficient ways to do that. What's especially painful is that baiting exploits your strengths. If you are empathic, reflective, conscientious, or conflict-averse, those traits become tools that are used against you. You want clarity, so you explain. You want harmony, so you smooth things over. You want fairness, so you defend yourself. And every one of those responses feeds the dynamic. The narcissistic person isn't moved by your logic or sincerity. They're energized by your engagement. People often ask, do they know they're doing this? And the answer is nuanced. They may not sit down and consciously plan every move, but the pattern is deeply ingrained. Over time, they've learned what gets reactions and what doesn't, and they repeat what works. That's why you'll notice the same themes, the same comments, the same timing. It's not random. It's conditioned behavior aimed at emotional leverage. Another key piece here is that baiting often shows up when accountability is looming. If you bring up an issue, suddenly you're the problem. If you express hurt, suddenly they're hurt more. If you ask for clarity, suddenly you're being aggressive or dramatic. The bait shifts the focus away from their behavior and onto your reaction. Control is restored not by solving the issue, but by destabilizing you. And this is why trying to win these interactions never works. You can be calm, you can be articulate, you can be factually correct, you can even be kind, and it still won't land. Because the goal was never understanding. The goal was impact. Once you realize that, you can stop blaming yourself for conversations that go nowhere. One of the most important things I want you to hear is this. If someone repeatedly provokes you, invalidates your responses, and then criticizes you for reacting, that is not miscommunication. That is manipulation. And recognizing that doesn't make you cynical or cold. It makes you informed. When you start to see baiting clearly, you also begin to notice how your body responds. There's often a spike of adrenaline, a sudden urge to explain, a feeling of being misunderstood. That's your cue. That moment is the hook, and the work becomes learning to pause there instead of taking the bait automatically. Now, I know this is hard, especially if you've been conditioned over years to believe that relationships are about fixing, engaging, and repairing at all costs. Walking away from bait can feel unnatural, even cruel. But it's not cruel, it's self-preserving. You are not required to participate in interactions that exist solely to destabilize you. Understanding that baiting is about control also helps release a lot of false hope. You stop waiting for the right way to say it. You stop believing that one perfect response will finally change things. And you start redirecting your energy back to yourself, where it belongs. This doesn't mean you become unkind or reactive in return. It means you become selective. You choose when and how you engage. You recognize that not every comment deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves access to your emotional world. And here's the hardest truth. When baiting stops working, the narcissistic person may escalate or withdraw. That's not a failure on your part. That's confirmation that the dynamic was about control all along. Your job is not to manage their reactions. Your job is to protect your peace. Once you truly understand that baiting is not about communication, you stop trying to communicate your way out of it. And that's when your power starts to come back. One of the reasons narcissistic baiting is so hard to spot is because it rarely arrives wearing a warning label. It doesn't come in loud accusations or obvious cruelty. Instead, it slips in sideways, dressed up as something harmless, even reasonable. And this is where so many people start doubting themselves. Because when the provocation is subtle, you're left wondering whether you imagined it, misunderstood it, or overreacted. That confusion is not an accident, it's the point. These are the comments that make you pause for just a second too long. The ones that sound almost kind but leave a sting behind. The remark that makes you think, was that an insult? Or am I being too sensitive? That moment of uncertainty is where the narcissistic person gains traction, because now you're off balance, and once you're off balance, you're easier to control. A classic example is the backhanded compliment, something that looks positive on the surface, but carries an undertone of criticism. You actually did a good job this time. You look nice. Much better than usual. I'm surprised you handled that so well. If you call it out, they can easily retreat. They'll tell you that you're reading into it, that they meant it kindly, that you're always looking for problems. And now the focus shifts from what they said to how you reacted. Another common tactic is the so-called joke. Humor becomes a shield. A sharp comment is delivered with a smile, and if you flinch, you're told you can't take a joke. What gets overlooked is that jokes don't usually leave people feeling small, exposed, or unsettled. But when humor is used this way, it gives them cover. They get the emotional hit, and if you object, you're painted as humorless or dramatic. There's also the vague criticism, the kind that never quite lands anywhere specific. Some people just aren't very reliable. Not everyone is good under pressure. Certain people take things too personally. Nothing is directly said, but you know who it's aimed at, and because it's not explicit, you're trapped. If you respond, you sound defensive. If you stay silent, you feel complicit. Either way, the comment has done its job. What makes these subtle provocations especially effective is something called plausible deniability. The narcissistic person can always claim innocence. That's not what I meant. You misunderstood. I was just making an observation. This forces you into a position where you either drop it and swallow the discomfort, or you try to explain your feelings again. And once again, the conversation becomes about your reaction, not their behavior. Over time, this kind of baiting trains you to second-guess yourself. You start editing your responses in real time. You hesitate before speaking. You replay conversations in your head, trying to determine what real happened. That mental load is exhausting, and it slowly erodes your confidence in your own perceptions. And when someone loses confidence in their internal compass, they become easier to manipulate. Another layer of sneakiness is timing. These comments often arrive when you're already vulnerable, when you're tired, stressed, or trying to enjoy yourself. Maybe you're having a good moment, and suddenly there's a remark that takes the air out of the room. That's not coincidence. Undermining your stability, even briefly, restores their sense of control. What's important to understand here is that these remarks are not about feedback or honesty. Healthy feedback is clear, respectful, and actionable. These comments are murky, indirect, and emotionally charged. Their purpose is not improvement, it's impact. They want to see the flicker of doubt cross your face. They want to feel that they still have access to your emotional state. And if you're someone who values communication, this is especially hard, because your instinct is to clarify. You might say, "What did you mean by that?" Or "That hurt my feelings." But here's the trap. Asking for clarification often gives them exactly what they want: more engagement, more emotional energy, more opportunity to invalidate your experience. When you express hurt, the response is rarely accountability. Instead, it's dismissal. "You're too sensitive. I didn't mean it that way. You always take things wrong." Notice how quickly the spotlight moves. The original comment disappears, and suddenly you're on trial for your emotional response. This is how subtle baiting keeps you stuck in a loop. They provoke. You react or question. They Eenie. You explain. They minimize. And around it goes. Meanwhile, nothing is resolved, but your energy is drained. One of the most painful parts of this dynamic is how isolating it can feel. Because from the outside, these comments don't look that bad. If you try to explain them to someone else, they may not get it. "That doesn't sound so terrible. Are you sure that's what they meant?" And now the doubt multiplies. Not only are you questioning yourself, but you're also feeling unseen by others. I want to say this clearly. If something consistently makes you feel small, confused, or unsettled, it deserves your attention, even if you can't fully articulate why. Emotional reality matters, even when there's no obvious smoking gun. Your body and mind are responding to something real. Learning to recognize subtle baiting means paying attention to patterns rather than individual comments. One remark in isolation may be ambiguous, but repeated ambiguity that always seems to land in the same painful place is not accidental. That's a strategy. As you become more aware of this, you may also notice an internal pressure to defend yourself. That urge is understandable, but it's also the hook. You don't owe anyone constant explanations for your feelings. You are not required to prove that something hurt you in order for it to matter. Disengaging from subtle baiting doesn't mean you suddenly confront every comment. In fact, it often means doing less, not more. Short responses, neutral tone, changing the subject, or sometimes saying nothing at all. The goal is not to correct them, it's to protect yourself, .br. And this can feel deeply uncomfortable at first. Because you've been trained believe that silence equals agreement, or that walking away equals losing. But in these dynamics, silence is often clarity. It's you choosing not to participate in a game designed to destabilize you. When subtle provocations stop getting reactions, their power diminishes. And that's when you start to feel something shift inside you. The fog lifts a little. Your confidence begins to return. You trust yourself more, and you realize that you don't need to win every exchange. You just need to stop bleeding energy in conversations that were never meant to be honest in the first place. If you leave with nothing else today, let it be this: when something feels off again and again, believe yourself and don't take the bait. Another especially powerful form of baiting shows up when the past is suddenly dragged into the present, but not as it actually happened. It comes back altered, blurred, selectively edited. And when this happens, you may feel an immediate rush to correct the record, to explain yourself, to defend your intentions. That urgency is exactly what's being targeted. Because rewriting history is one of the most effective ways to provoke engagement while avoiding accountability. This kind of baiting often sounds calm on the surface. It may even sound reflective. "You've always been this way. This is what you did last time. Remember how you reacted back then?" And as you listen, something inside you tightens, because that's not how you remember it. Important details are missing. Context has vanished. Your feelings have been minimized or erased. And suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what's happening now. It's about a version of the past that paints you it's the problem. When someone distorts history like this, your instinct is to correct it. You want accuracy, you want fairness, you want to be seen. You may start listing facts, timelines, and examples. You may find yourself saying that's not what happened or you're leaving out what you did. But here's the painful truth. The narcissistic person is not interested in accuracy. They are interested in destabilization. The moment you step into defense mode, the bait has worked. Rewriting the past serves several purposes at once. First, it shifts the spotlight off their behavior. If the narrative becomes about your supposed flaws, their actions fade into the background. Second, it triggers self-doubt. Even if you're confident in your memory, hearing a distorted version repeatedly can make you question yourself. And third, it keeps you emotionally engaged. You're pulled into the role of explaining, justifying, and clarifying, while they sit comfortably in accusation. This tactic is especially effective against people who value reflection and accountability. If you're someone who's willing to look at your own behavior, you might think, maybe I did overreact. Maybe I could have handled that better. That openness is healthy in balanced relationships. But here, it's exploited. Your willingness to self-examine becomes the very thing that keeps you trapped in the loop. Another layer of this tactic is emotional rewriting. Not only do they distort events, they also distort how you felt. They might say, you were never really hurt. You didn't seem that upset at the time, you're exaggerating now. This invalidates your emotional experience and pressures you to defend not just your actions, but your feelings. And defending your feelings is exhausting. What makes this even more confusing is that sometimes the past events being referenced were genuinely chaotic or painful. Maybe there were arguments, maybe there were raised voices, maybe you did react strongly at times, but context matters. Chronic provocation, gaslighting, and emotional erosion change how people respond. When the past is rewritten without context, it becomes a weapon rather than a lesson. You may also notice how selective the memory becomes. Their hurt is remembered in vivid detail. Yours is blurry or non-existent. Their intentions are always noble, yours are always questionable. This imbalance is not accidental, it's narrative control. And whoever controls the narrative controls the emotional power in the relationship. There's also a timing element to this bait. The past is often brought up right when you try to address something current. You raise a concern, and suddenly you're being reminded of something you did months or years ago. The conversation derails. The emotional energy shifts. And once again, you're defending yourself instead of being heard. Over time, this can train you to stay silent. You learn that bringing up issues only leads to character assassination, so you swallow your concerns, you minimize your needs, and that silence is mistaken for peace, when really it's resignation. It's important to understand that in healthy relationships, the past is used to learn and repair. In narcissistic dynamics, the past is used to blame and dominate. There is no mutual reflection. There is no shared responsibility. There is only the repetition of a story that keeps you all. And here's where many people get stuck. They believe that if they could just explain it one more time, clearly enough, calmly enough, the truth would finally land. But it doesn't. Because this isn't about misunderstanding. It's about control. The rewritten history is not an error, it's a tool. The moment you stop arguing about the past, something shifts. That doesn't mean you agree with their version. It means you recognize that engaging with it costs you more than it gives you. You don't need their permission to know what you lived through. Your memory does not need their validation to be real. This is incredibly hard, especially for people who have been gaslit for a long time. Trusting your own recollection can feel shaky at first. But your emotional responses, the confusion, the hurt, the exhaustion, are data. They tell a story even when the facts are being contested. You may also notice how quickly these conversations escalate. The more you defend, the more accusations appear. The more you explain, the more your words are twisted. That escalation is another clue. Healthy clarification de-escalates. Manipulative baiting intensifies. Stepping out of this trap doesn't require winning the argument. It requires refusing the premise. You are not obligated to relitigate the past with someone who uses it as a weapon. You are not required to defend yourself against a narrative designed to keep you engaged and off balance. And yes, when you stop engaging, they may accuse you of being avoidant or dismissive. That accusation is itself another bait. The goal is to pull you back into the fight, but choosing not to argue about a distorted past is not avoidance. It's discern me. And he. As you begin to disengage from these historical rewrites, you may feel grief. Grief for the understanding you never received. Grief for the conversations that never led anywhere. That grief is real and it matters. But clarity eventually follows, and clarity is grounding. When you no longer feel compelled to defend your reality, you reclaim something essential, your sense of self. And once that happens, the bait loses its power because you are no longer trying to be believed by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to convince them of the truth. You need to stay rooted in it. Another form of baiting that often goes unrecognized is silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from needing space or calming down, but a very specific, strategic silence that leaves you unsettled. It's the unanswered message, the delayed response, the sudden emotional withdrawal that happens without explanation. And because there's no obvious confrontation, people often don't label it as baiting. But make no mistake, when silence is used this way, it is just as provocative as words. This kind of silence usually appears when the narcissistic person wants to reassert control without looking overtly aggressive. Maybe you said no. Maybe you stopped accommodating them. Maybe you didn't respond the way you usually do, and instead of arguing, they disappear, they go quiet. And in that quiet, anxiety grows. You start wondering what you did wrong, whether they're angry, whether you should reach out. That internal spiral is the hook. What makes this tactic so powerful is that it exploits your attachment system. Humans are wired for connection. When connection is suddenly withdrawn, especially without explanation, the nervous system goes into alarm mode. Your mind starts scanning for danger, for mistakes, for ways to restore equilibrium. And the narcissistic person knows this, consciously or not. They know that withholding creates urgency. You may find yourself checking your phone repeatedly, drafting messages, deleting them, rewriting them. Maybe you send something neutral just to test the waters. Maybe you apologize even if you're not sure what you're apologizing for. Each of these moves brings the attention back to them. Each one confirms that the silence is working. This kind of baiting is especially effective with empathic, conscientious people. If you care about others' feelings, silence feels unbearable. You assume responsibility. You think, if something's wrong, I should fix it. But here's the painful reality. The silence is the strategy. There is nothing to fix because nothing is actually being communicated. Another layer of this tactic is unpredictability. Sometimes the silence lasts hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. And then, just as suddenly, they reappear, often acting as if nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no explanation. That unpredictability keeps you hypervigilant. You never quite know where you stand, and that instability keeps you emotionally invested. And if you dare to ask about it, if you say, hey, when you disappear like that, it really affects me, you're often met with deflection. I was busy. I needed space. You're too needy. Once again, the focus shifts. Your emotional response becomes the problem, not their behavior, and you're left feeling ashamed for wanting basic consistency. It's important to distinguish this from healthy boundaries. Healthy silence is communicated. It comes with clarity. I need time to think. I'll reach out later. Baiting silence comes with ambiguity. No context, no reassurance, no timeline, just absence. And absence, when used intentionally, becomes a form of control. Over time, this pattern conditions you. You learn that connection is fragile and can be taken away at any moment, so you adapt. You become more careful with your words. You avoid bringing up issues. You prioritize their comfort over your own, and slowly your world shrinks around the goal of keeping the peace. This is also why silence baiting often escalates during moments when you're becoming more independent. When you start to detach emotionally, when you stop reacting, when you stop chasing, that's when the withdrawal becomes more pronounced. It's a test. Will you come back? Will you reach for me? Do I still matter enough to disrupt you? And if you don't respond the way they expect, The silence may eventually be replaced with anger, accusations, or sudden affection. These shifts aren't random, they're all attempts to regain engagement. Silence is just one tool in the kit. One of the hardest parts of this is how lonely it feels. You're not fighting, you're not arguing, you're just waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to matter again. That kind of waiting can wear down even the strongest sense of self. Recognizing this as baiting can be both painful and freeing. Painful because it means accepting that the silence isn't about misunderstanding or overwhelm. Freeing because it means you can stop trying to decode it. There is no hidden message that will suddenly make it make sense. The work here is learning to tolerate the discomfort without chasing it away. And that's not easy. It means sitting with uncertainty. It means resisting the urge to explain yourself or smooth things over. It means reminding yourself that someone else's withdrawal does not define your worth. You may also notice an internal voice saying, "If I just reach out one more time, this will end." Sometimes it does, but at a cost. Because every time you break the silence, the pattern is reinforced. The message becomes withholding gets results. When you start responding differently, when you don't chase, don't over-explain, don't beg, the dynamic begins to shift. They may escalate. They may accuse you of being cold or uncaring. That accusation, too, is bait. The goal is to provoke guilt and pull you back in. Choosing not to react to silence is not the same as being emotionally unavailable. It's being emotionally boundaried. It's recognizing that healthy connection does not require you to abandon yourself to keep someone else close. As this becomes clearer, you may feel grief. Grief for the connection you hoped for. Grief for the conversations that never happened. Grief for the reassurance you didn't receive. That grief deserves space, but it doesn't require you to return to a dynamic that harms you. Silence loses its power when you stop interpreting it as a verdict on your worth. When you no longer rush to fill the gap, you reclaim your agency. And in that space, something steadier can begin to grow. Your own sense of grounding, independent of their presence or absence. Silence only controls you when you believe it means something about you. Another baiting tactic that can be especially hard to recognize because it looks so emotional, so vulnerable, is when the narcissistic person suddenly becomes the victim. This is not genuine vulnerability. This is performance, and it's incredibly effective, particularly with empathic, caring people who are wired to respond to distress. It often happens right after you've set a boundary, expressed a concern, or stopped accommodating them. Instead of addressing what you raised, the emotional spotlight swings dramatically in their direction. Suddenly, they're wounded, misunderstood, overwhelmed. You're no longer talking about the issue, you're tending to their pain. And just like that, the original concern disappears. This bait can sound dramatic or subtle. It might be a heavy sigh followed by, "I guess I just mess everything up." Or, "No one ever understands me." Or, "After everything I've been through, this is what I get." The words may vary, but the emotional message is consistent. "You've hurt me. Fix this." And if you're someone with empathy, your nervous system lights up. You feel guilt. You feel concern. You feel an urge to soothe. You may immediately start reassuring them, backtracking on what you said, softening your boundary, or apologizing, just to stop the emotional collapse. That response is human, but it's also exactly what this tactic is designed to produce. What makes this so disorienting is that it flips the roles. You came in with the legitimate concern. Now you're the one comforting, you're the one explaining, you're the one feeling like the bad person. This reversal happens so fast that many people don't even realize it's occurred until much later, if at all. Victim baiting often leans heavily on implication rather than direct accusation. They don't always say, "You're cruel." Instead, they say things like, "I guess my feelings don't matter," or "I always end up being the bad guy." The burden is placed on you to infer the accusation and then resolve it. That ambiguity keeps you engaged. Another layer of this tactic is moral pressure. You're made to feel that being kind, loving, or understanding means abandoning your needs. If you continue holding your boundary, you're framed as cold or heartless. If you stand your ground, you're accused of lacking empathy. And that's a painful bind for people who genuinely care about others. What's important to understand is that this is not mutual vulnerability. Mutual vulnerability includes accountability. It includes curiosity about impact. It includes a willingness to repair. Victim baiting includes none of that. There is no ownership, no reflection, just emotional display designed to pull you back into line. And often, the suffering they describe is vague or exaggerated. It may be rooted in real pain, but it's weaponized in the moment. The timing is key. The victim narrative appears precisely when attention is shifting away from them or when they're being asked to look at themselves. The pain becomes a shield. You may notice that when you respond with empathy, the emotional crisis resolves quickly. The tears dry, the heaviness lifts. The connection feels restored temporarily, but the original issue remains unaddressed. And that's the pattern. Emotional intensity replaces resolution. Over time, this conditions you. You learn that raising issues leads to emotional fallout. You start preemptively managing their feelings. You soften your words. You stay quiet. You minimize your needs. And you tell yourself you're doing it out of kindness. But the cost is your voice. Another painful piece of this dynamic is how much responsibility you end up carrying. You're not just responsible for your behavior. You're responsible for their emotional state. If they're upset, it must be because you did something wrong. If they're distressed, you must fix it. That level of responsibility is neither healthy nor fair. And if you ever question this, if you say, I can care about you and still need this boundary, you may be met with escalation, more tears, more withdrawal, more accusations of cruelty. That escalation is meant to teach you a lesson. Don't try this again. People often ask, but what if they really are hurting? And that's such an important question because yes, people who use this tactic often have real pain. But pain does not excuse manipulation, and someone's suffering does not entitle them to control you. In healthy relationships, pain leads to conversation. In narcissistic dynamics, pain leads to coercion. One invites closeness. The other demands compliance. You may also notice that their victimhood is highly selective. They are devastated when you set a boundary, but remarkably resilient when they hurt you. Your pain is minimized or ignored. The imbalance is telling. This tactic is especially effective against people who were taught that love means sacrifice, that being good means being selfless. That conflict is dangerous. If that's your conditioning, victim baiting hits deep. It taps into old fears of abandonment and rejection, and suddenly, you're not an adult making a choice. You're a child trying not to be the bad one. Recognizing this pattern can bring up a lot of grief. Grief for the empathy you gave that wasn't reciprocated. Grief for the conversations that never went anywhere. Grief for the parts of yourself you silenced to keep the peace. That grief matters. It deserves space. But clarity matters too, and clarity sounds like this. You are allowed to have needs without someone else collapsing. You are allowed to set boundaries without being cast as the villain. You are allowed to care without self-erasing. Disengaging from victim baiting doesn't mean becoming unkind. It means refusing to take responsibility for emotions that are being used to control you. It might look like acknowledging feelings without abandoning your position. It might look like staying calm and not rushing to fix. It might look like stepping back entirely. And yes, this can provoke backlash. You may be accused of being insensitive, of changing, of not caring anymore. Those accusations are designed to sting. They are designed to pull you back into the old role, but staying grounded through that discomfort is how the pattern breaks. When you stop rescuing, something important happens. You begin to see how often emotional crises were used to derail accountability. You begin to feel less anxious about saying no. You begin to trust yourself more. And that trust is powerful. Victim baiting only works when you believe their pain requires your self-sacrifice. After understanding all of these tactics, the provocation, the subtle digs, the rewritten history, the silence, the victim performance, there's a question that naturally comes up. What am I actually supposed to do? And the answer people often don't want to hear at first is this. The most powerful response is not a better argument, a calmer tone, or the perfect explanation. The most powerful response is not taking the bait at all. That sounds simple. It's anything but. Because by the time you're dealing with narcissistic baiting, your nervous system has been trained. You're primed to respond. You feel the pull in your body before your mind even catches up. The urge to explain, the urge to defend, the urge to fix, the urge to soothe. Not taking the bait feels unnatural because reacting has become a survival strategy. For a long time, your reactions kept things from getting worse. They prevented explosions. They restored temporary peace. They brought short-lived closeness. So of course your system wants to keep doing what once worked. The problem is that what once helped you survive is now what keeps you stuck. Not taking the bait does not mean pretending nothing hurts. It does not mean suppressing emotions. And it does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It means choosing not to hand over your emotional energy to interactions that are designed to destabilize you. This is where people often get confused. They think disengagement means silence forever, or cutting someone off immediately, or acting indifferent. That's not what this is about. It's about discernment. It's about recognizing when an interaction has crossed from communication into control. When you don't take the bait, you may still speak, but you speak differently, shorter, calmer, less explanatory. You stop over-justifying. You stop trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You stop giving speeches to an audience that has already decided the verdict. This can feel terrifying at first, because when you change your responses, the other person often changes theirs. Baiting works because it gets results. When it stops working, it can escalate. You may see more accusations, more guilt-tripping, more emotional drama. That escalation is not proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof the strategy is failing. And this is where so many people turn back. The discomfort spikes. The pressure intensifies. You start thinking, maybe I should just explain one more time. But that's the moment that matters most. Because if you hold steady through that discomfort, something important happens. The dynamic begins to reveal itself clearly. Not taking the bait also means tolerating being misrepresented. And that's one of the hardest parts. You may be accused of being cold, avoidant, selfish, unkind, or changed. Your instinct will be to correct that narrative. But remember, narcissistic baiting thrives on your need to be seen as good. When you stop chasing a flattering version of yourself in their eyes, you reclaim your freedom. This is also where boundaries stop being theoretical and start being lived. A boundary is not something you announce once and hope the other person respects. In these dynamics, boundaries are enforced through behavior, through what you engage with and what you don't, through what you respond to and what you let pass. And let's be honest, sometimes not taking the bait means grieving. Grieving the relationship you hoped for. Grieving the conversations that never led to understanding. Grieving the version of yourself who kept trying because you believed effort would be rewarded. That grief is real and it deserves compassion, but alongside that grief comes relief. A quiet relief that shows up when your nervous system isn't constantly activated, when your mind isn't replaying conversations, when you're not walking on eggshells. That relief is information. It tells you what safety actually feels like. Another important piece of this is letting go of the idea that you need closure from them. Closure comes from clarity, not cooperation. You don't need their acknowledgement to know what you experienced. You don't need their apology to move forward. Waiting for them to validate your reality keeps you tied to them emotionally. Not taking the bait also means redirecting your energy. Instead of investing it in defending yourself, you invest it in grounding yourself, in relationships that feel mutual, in activities that restore you, in a life that doesn't revolve around managing someone else's emotional state. And yes, sometimes the consequence of not taking the bait is distance, emotional distance, physical distance, or complete disengagement. That can be painful, but it can also be peaceful. And peace is not something you should have to earn by self-erasure. If you've been in these dynamics for a long time, you may need to practice this in small ways. You don't have to get it perfect. You will slip. You will react sometimes. That doesn't erase your progress. Awareness itself is movement forward. Each time you pause instead of reacting, you weaken the pattern. Each time you choose not to explain, not to chase, not to fix, you strengthen your sense of self. And over time, that self becomes less reactive, more grounded, more anchored in reality. The narcissistic person may never change. That's not the point. The change that matters is internal. It's the shift from asking, "How do I make this stop?" to asking, "Why am I still engaging with something that harms me?" When you stop taking the bait, you're not giving up, you're waking up. And that is where your real power lives. Your peace begins the moment you stop reacting to what was designed to provoke you.